Hello all, and I haven't done a musings video in a while, which is what these generalities videos tend to be. So I wanted to do a new one for you guys since I didn't do a video last week because I had some personal things to deal with. They're all good now though, but so I wanted to, of course, start with, as you would expect, with regards to the Mar-a-Lago raid. But as I'm recording this, there's been, a sort of steady stream of, people on the right or people that have this sort of affiliation, if you will, towards the right. Really having the agencies really, mobilized against them. It seems, Alex Jones, Lindell looks like he got pursued by the FBI today or yesterday. So there's a lot of Bannon is always in court, it seems, in the last 5 years. So you can definitely see the antagonism of the agencies and these state apparatuses, going against Trump allies or perceived allies. Of course, in my opinion, with the Mar-a-Lago situation was really orchestrated and timed with the lack of fruits, if you will, with the January 6th committee, which obviously is just totally forgotten now. You might as well have never met up and had those congressional meetups to begin with. Nobody cares anymore. Everyone's already moved on, which is exactly what you would have expected. So now we shift gears to, is Trump going to get indicted for, having these state archives or delicate information, which, of course, it's already dubious to, disclose to the American public that, this sort of unsafe material is, out and about and being seized upon. The idea that we would be informed on this is it's already dubious to begin with. You don't need to think too hard about where this is going. This is meant to, of course, dissuade your good faith centrist, if you will, in voting this midterms on, for any down ballot Republicans, any sort of Trump appointee or, Trump nod in the sort of electoral sense, if you will. This is, of course, going to dampen and will not know any of these findings or any of these so-called, whether or not he's going to get indicted or not. You can be assured that this is going to not go away before November. I'm willing to bet on that. But I do think, though, that these things do need to be taken seriously, and these people are playing for keeps. They are mobilizing, the agencies against Trump appointees, and I think that just goes to show, at least, people on the ground level just, trying to, speak really any sort of off-kilter, off-brand sort of thinking in discourse, really. You're up for grabs. That's for certain, and it's important to keep that in mind. But I also think that we have to be, somewhat brave and not let this totally demoralize you. But I do think that the answer is, as I talked about last year, it's kind of interesting to look at those province videos now a year later, where I sort of predicted that the agencies were definitely going to be sweeping in. There's going to be a lot of censorship and this is why we needed to develop this sort of catacomb culture, as the late Roger Scruton is described. Where within these sort of cultural forms, we're trying to, establish resources, just on that level, but also actually put out our ideas for what is the good life, what is family, trying to maintain that sort of essence of what our culture has been for the last 2 or 3 centuries. But with regards to that, these things obviously are a process that takes many years to build this sort of networking, or even find really the will. That's one of the things perhaps in my readings of Nietzsche lately on the channel. We do have to question the wills of not just our enemies but ourselves, with what are people willing to actually sacrifice for these sort of desires that bring us all here. But what those desires actually look like in concrete political reality. Ask 10 dissidents what they think of what kind of changes they would make to statecraft, and you'll probably get you might get 10 different answers. So I think those kind of questions are important with regards to what actually wills us, and the strength of that will. Even a lot of people, I don't think, are willing to give up the positions or lack of culture, or even in a stagnant state. It's very enticing to stick with the same formula and what used to work. But in much more somber news, if we're going to switch gears here, I did wanted to brush up on Alexander Dugin's assassination of his daughter, and attempted assassination of him, I would suppose, as well. And it's very sad, obviously, where you could see the tenseness of these pieces here lately about Dugin by the mainstream media, where I think they were overemphasizing his influence on Putin. 2022 isn't exactly the philosopher's age, and so the idea that Dugin just had incredible influence over Putler. I don't think it's I don't think it was anything like that at all. I think that Putin sees Dugin as a very smart man, but a lot of people do. And at the end of the day, this was just a university professor who really liked Platonic forms, and his theory. I don't think, at least at a current time, his fourth political theory was exactly the most threatening towards the globalist empire. But nonetheless, I think this does say something about the democratic warfare state in current year, if you will, where everyone's free game. Anyone that the journalists or attention is brought can be misrepresented. And we see this quite literally with the optics surrounding the regime talking of this conflict. There's two side-by-side images of this war going on at the same time, where you have different narratives competing against each other from the same event of conflict, and it seems in lockstep with resources being sent out overseas, and attaining them. And there was a really interesting speech actually that I saw in translation, hopefully it was a proper one, of Putin, talking of political realism, and I think that's an interesting dichotomy that I've noticed with Russia and this sort of return to realism of actually caring about material resources in the way of analyzing the world, and the sort of focus on that sort of production, and I think that is one of the things that really entice a lot of people around here with Putin and Russia, is that sort of return to realism. He basically had warned to Europe about the impending energy issues to come, and why Russia has this sort of advantage here, simply because they took the geopolitical realities a bit more serious than the European Union. And I think that's again very interesting to perhaps piece at here, with Putin trying to represent this sort of political realism, contrary to the West, at least on how he's trying to present it in the optics on the world stage here. But I also wanted to synchronize that with structure analysis. I think that goes in lockstep with what we're trying to do here, with trying to understand these political structures, how they operate, what their motives could be for statecraft. But there is something to be said with how this still will be insufficient, especially with modern techniques right now. Simply because if you look at how Ukraine and Russia still are their best trading partners, and of course, you look through the American Civil War, you always had capitalists, if you will, with ulterior motives to the geopolitical realities around them, to maybe two states being antagonistic toward each other, but still maintaining trade or relations with each other in that sort of sort of personalized way. The trading still, it almost seems as if it's going or even booming in a way because of this conflict, and I think it's in an unprecedented way that we haven't seen before. Because ultimately, I think, without going too far off here, but I do like to bridge philosophy towards these more concrete, cultural phenomenon and politics in general. And that is, of course, that with the internet, with society really being liquefied down into digital presence, each person onto his own civilization. I've talked about this before on Twitter, where our individual egos are now not just because of social media, with concepts like the avatar and what we're allowed to show each other on these apps at any given time, and how we kind of choose our own social masking out of this with our pictures or concepts that we're trying to share to each other, or memes even. These sort of ways, and this sort of giantism, if it will, towards someone's own personality. The way it highlights it, especially with something like this video camera here, it's highlighting me right in front of it, my voice and my image, in a way that quite frankly will make you self-conscious. And I think that sort of self-consciousness, not just is interesting, of course, to consider onto one's own individual aspect, but think about how narratives, if you will, are now crafted out of this soundbite. But you sort of canonize history with your own YouTube algorithm with, you pick apart these sort of sound bites, and I think that, our elites are wised up to this with, they know that there's this sort of playback ability of, searching for these clips and these things that, towards these events that, these memes, if you will, or just, small increments that, totally define someone, and their digital presence or even, real life presence. This is, of course, something that I've really emphasized since the start of this channel, this sort of difference between your digital presence and your real life presence, and how in contemporary culture, the digital presence is actually, for the first time in history, of course, is actually superseding our actual personal presence. I think the internet has created your own civilization onto yourself. This sort of state relations now have definitely shifted because of technics. I think that's a fair thing to say. But if we're going to move on here, I'm going to take a swig of water real quick. Obviously, since the Queen passed away this past week, there's been your typical melting down and internet ire towards back and forth of trying to disrespect each other as much as possible, which of course is another thing that's just superficially enhanced with the digital space, this sort of antagonism. If this was how we all operated in real life, we would all just burn everything down. Clearly, that sort of old saying of not saying this in presence certainly is applicable here. But the Queen did pass, and I think that one of the interesting things that I did find out of it, though, was the hauntology, if you will, out of the left, and their reaction, of course, as you might expect, with the resentful attitudes of a colonizer, this figure, and passing and using that resentment against them and people who identify with the monarch, or by extension the nation state. But there is an active hauntology here with how powerful really is this symbolic monarch. There is certainly the cultural aspect, but in the dynamics of power, the Queen hasn't exactly had well-known input into this for quite some time. These are the celebrators of democracy, after all, and their avatars. But nonetheless, when it comes to the sort of misdirection of ire, which definitely encapsulates how the left has been seen, I think, in recent memory, with it just seems that the left is just hell-bent on not allowing descriptions of events and an actual responsibility for greater culture to actually take place. It's just why do you even care to begin with? Isn't that weird? These sort of questioning of your sincerity, of not just your own well-being, but the people around you's well-being. I think that's one of the main distinctions between these two sort of polarizing visions of society now, among the left and the right. But yeah, I think that ultimately, though, this just goes back to that sort of classical Marxism of these classic ways of looking at class consciousness, or the political structure, even if it is hundreds of years old now, and technology, I think, has definitely changed. We don't live in the industrial area anymore, or the industrial era anymore. So, the consciousness will shift, and I don't think a lot of these leftists are, paying attention to that or really care about these sort of questions. I think they just simply want to represent the left in this sort of historical context, which I think is a consequence really of, declaring the end of history, in our childhood, if you will, and or at least my childhood, and there's no sort of creative aspect to, coming out of the end of history or the end of civilization. Trying to progress out of that is futile, and I think that just reconstructing these past specters is all that we really get anymore. But there was also the recent discussion of these sort of cultural forms, and this was, of course, really discussed at length at the start of the NFL season this past week, where it's discussed at large about these corporations who clearly do not and are even willing to give that sort of reward patronage, if you will, towards greater society of excluding these sort of ideas. I'll admit that I definitely, you can see on my channel, I definitely have, worn NFL apparel once or twice in these videos, and it's definitely a shortcoming on my end with regards to, clearly this mega corporation doesn't identify with me, and they probably want nothing to do with me. So why would you give them your money? And that's a very salient point. But there's also the point of, we don't really have any other alternative, and this isn't just a gripe of therefore we must just give up and give the NFL everything they want because they're just unquestioned, and there's just so much time and energy put into sports. And I think we can overlay this with Spengler's thought of the pseudomorphosis of a civilization. As demographics shift, of course, on a biological basis, there's also the ideas and cultural basis. And when you have a people who ultimately embody being and aid each other and have a sort of interplay relationship with the world on a shared world horizon, as Heidegger would call it. These sort of forms, these sort of not just the circus act, if you will, or the things that are supposedly just distracting. There is sort of this essence of togetherness, of this sort of ritual. You could argue, of course, that this is just an extension of our failure of myth and religion now in a secular society, and I don't think you would be wrong with that. But there's not exactly anything around that's enticing and culturally interesting that isn't just consumed on the digital sphere or just glorified sports idols, which I think also is a consequence of there not being any good men around anymore. We look to these sports idols now for inspiration, but I think if you have a good father figure in your life, certainly as I grew up with a present father, there's nothing really that can compete with a good man, a good family man. That will be your guide. You don't need to look for these sort of sports idols. So I think that definitely goes hand in hand with the fallenness of family life in American culture. And so, you have this pseudomorphosis where these past cultural forms, when a new invasion happens or a new culture tries to break in through these old forms, Toynbee would say that there's that sort of I think it's that sort of environment and cultural conflict where a budding civilization can die off because the external factors are too much for it. And I think that also applies with the cultural forms. You can be a shadow culture, or that sort of satellite civilization that he talks about, where you break off from a prior culture's forms, but you don't actually. It's just in homage back to it. There's nothing actually new about it, or a sort of high class civilization that springs out of it. It's just a pseudomorphosis, and I think that really applies with a lot of culture at hand now, where obviously after postmodernity, where everything is liquefied, everything gets deconstructed. Going back to these past narratives and forms, or reconstructing them is the task at hand in hypermodernity. Also trying to, Spengler talks at length at the start of, I think it's either volume 1 or volume 2, when there's a plethora of great men around, they make the herd that much greater with them. And when that starts to go away, as a culture passes through these different morphologies of phases and starts to lose that, the cultural metabolism also goes down, as well as formerly just men who would have otherwise been mediocre who became better, now just sink into mediocrity, or sink even lower as decadence takes over. So that sort of drainage, if you will, applies, I think, definitely today in this civilizational stage where, our creative people, they don't have the resources, they don't even have a state really that wants to represent them. And we've seen with the speeches here lately, there definitely is that sort of feeling of not wanting to actually unify us. And it's not simply us on, the right on BitChute or, obscure YouTube videos. It's pretty explicit on all the mainstream news cycles that we're in the middle of a jettison, at least on this sort of ideological basis. And so I think it's important to consider that, whether or not you think that, and what the actual power players are thinking. But to wrap up, I figured I also would talk a little bit about, as we see this sort of digital exclusion, of course, how many people will need to be sort of purged, if you will, from this sort of digital space, from this sort of social media, before there's actual, repercussions, before, these creative people who, would have otherwise been able to use their energy perhaps in a positive way, more, of course, orientated towards us, perhaps, at some point, will there, almost simply by a sleight of hand of their own misstep, of overstepping, perhaps, where, you exclude, too many people from the club, and therefore an alternative club has to be made, or what I consider the sort of digital proletarian, which if you look at now with, and of course there is a lot of consequence with this, there will be, of course, unintended consequences. You see with, a job, a factory job, an industrial job, no longer also ties you towards soil with this sort of rise of sort of the digital workforce. You can tune in, from anywhere to get into the digital workspace, regardless of where you're positioned. And so now you have the prospect of, the boss sort of coming into your actual space at home, and how now that has also converged together, where I don't think many people on the right consider that, with this sort of capitalism and techniques, bridged together in hypermodernity, where corporations now are becoming the father figure for us. And what are the consequences for that? Corporations now are willing to provide humanitarian sort of patronage. We see with the cubicles, and I talked about last year with Disney trying to set up their sort of dormitories or something like that, where the sort of experience of Disney now is encapsulated with actually living on the quarters of these sort of fantastical lands, or fantasy lands, in that sort of way. And I think this all leads to the corporations providing for us in a way that hadn't been seen before. They are now supplanting the family life, or trying to make up for it as a consequence of falling. And I think one of the things as well, if we were to go back perhaps to football or the NFL, this sort of narrative of go woke, go broke. Corporations no longer are simply just entities trying to maximize profits. You live in this sort of, as discussed earlier with material realism, if you will, or this sort of resurgence that Putin talks about. You no longer live in that sort of society in American culture. Profits are secondary now towards humanitarian and concerns by the corporation. They are more than willing to give up a couple of commas for what they deem they believe in, and I think a lot of people are unprepared for that sort of thing. I think this might tie in as well with the sort of grifting and if we were to talk for a second about how a lot of us here are trying to resurrect or reconstruct past ways of life that we know are diminishing, whether or not that's on the basis of political rot or technology. In either case, there is that sort of feeling or anxiousness of things that used to be true, or values that used to be true because of prior circumstances and prior horizons, are falling to the wayside or being forgotten. And so I think one of the redeeming things, and one of the things that really energizes people around here, is trying to find those virtues, but not just buying a bunch of products aimed towards this is what it would be like to have that sort of thing. You see with masculinity and these sort of products around here that are aimed towards expressing your masculinity. I think this is a false path, and a dying act, actually, of a consequence of the illumination of hypermodern capitalism, where these sort of virtues are superficially placed upon us through digital media. And we see this now as something that you can buy into, something that you could actually purchase, as opposed to an actual experience or actually living by these virtues towards your human experience or your subjectivity, as opposed to just buying a bunch of crap, quite literally. But I wanted to end here with some actual political analysis with the midterms will be here in 2 months, and less than actually now as I record this. And so I think it's actually kind of disappointing, but also expected if you've watched all my videos on here. With we saw at the beginning of the year there was this sort of internal memoirs going around of trying to drop the pandemic restrictions, trying to get away from that sort of thing among people on the left, at least the sort of politically inclined, or the ones that need to have expedience towards the political climate. And we saw that sort of you need to declare victory, walk away now. The midterms are coming, and we can kind of see perhaps the unfortunateness of our attention spans is, things are dialed back compared to last year when we were all being threatened to lose our jobs. But we can already see that if we were going to examine what the red wave, if you will, was going to look like last year compared to now, it's diminished quite a bit. The House, I think, is sort of a given. It would be a huge disappointment to not get the House back with the way the map's set up this time. But I don't think that last year when we were talking about the Senate getting 5 or 6 seats towards the Republicans, I don't think that's going to happen now for a number of reasons, but mainly I think it's just because of the attention span actually of the average voter. Sadly to say, but trying to punish people for, although they deserve it, of course, restrictions from 2 years ago, it's a tough ask, actually, for the American public to do. Although I do think that it's imperative and important that we try our best to do this through the means of the ways we were taught as a republic, even despite some questionable results in the last cycle. But just to end, I also want to perhaps suggest that I do not think that when Donald Trump declares his intention to run, that I don't expect him to be primaried, and I don't think that would be a good idea, actually. I don't think DeSantis is going to run. I think he's going to stay in Florida because it's a very important and key state, and he has a huge advantage over a Democrat who used to actually consider himself a conservative, which you're dead in the water to the left if you have that background. So DeSantis is going to easily carry Florida, and he's pretty comfy. He's young. He doesn't need to get involved in 2024 yet. And I think it would be, better for the right by and large if he did wait it out until 2028. I still think that despite people's criticisms of Trump, that when it comes to the actual intentionality to what's important to getting back at these people, Trump has more skin in the game than anyone, and I think we need to recognize that is really what has to be done on the right. And so I think if he wasn't primaried, that would be a big a showing of strength, quite frankly, but also showing to enemies that there is this sort of unified front here. And this will, of course, put pressure on the Democrats, who is going to have a chaotic field. I don't think that Joe's going to run again in 2024, and Kamala isn't even a top 5 candidate this last time around. So it's going to be open in the air. There's going to be a lot of people trying to vie for that. And if you just have Trump, doing a general election campaign, just simply focusing on, the worst aspects, the worst candidates possible, I think that would be really successful for Donald Trump and the Republicans. But that remains to be seen, of course. And like I said, it is somewhat disappointing to consider that there will likely be, gains for the Republicans in November, but I don't think it'll be nearly to the magnum that we expected even last year. So there's something to consider there, I think, with our attention spans, really, and how the elites are going to, react to that. I think it will be a very big disaster if they walk away completely unscathed, even though so many of them have already retired preemptively. What sort of message does that send for the future? But I hope you guys like this mishmash musings video of trying to use philosophy, use these sort of concepts in actual, tangible, real-life events. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you for my discussions on Husserl and intentionality and conscious structures. So if you guys like that sort of stuff, make sure to stay tuned.